In this PowerPoint presentation, I want to talk about Jesus and Messianic expectations. What I'm going to be talking about here is the scandal of the gospel. I want to begin with some initial observations and clarifications. First, the word Messiah is actually the word that we translate as Christ in the English versions of our Bibles. The word just means anointed one. In other words, someone anointed with oil or smeared with oil. The Hebrew word is Mashiach, and that's basically what it means. It has to do with being anointed with oil. And numerous people in the Old Testament could be anointed ones. Kings could be, priests could be, prophets could be. Um, Second, I want to emphasize that the word Messiah or Christ is a title. It is not a last name. In other words, Christ, when we say Jesus Christ, Christ is not Jesus' last name. If Jesus went down to the Department of Motor Vehicles, he would not return with a driver's license that said Christ, comma Jesus, because Christ is a title, not a last name. So when we say Jesus Christ, we are saying we're making a messianic claim for Jesus. We are saying that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. Finally, I want to clarify that messiahs were never understood either in the Old Testament or in the what we call the Second Temple period of Judaism, basically between the Testaments. Messiahs were never conceived as being divine. Messiahs were always understood as being human beings. Now, to bring Jesus and first century messianic expectations into focus, I want us to have a look at a gospel passage. I want us to look at Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, Mark 8:27 to 33. There we will see that Peter gets it right when Jesus asks him about who he thinks he is. But there is a caveat. Let's look at that passage. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he rebuked them so they wouldn't tell anyone about him. I want to stop reading there for a moment and point out a couple things about what we just read. Notice what the people actually say, or I'm sorry, notice what the disciples actually say that the people are saying about his identity. John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. What is the common denominator in that group? Obviously, it is that they are identifying Jesus as a prophet, because certainly John the Baptist was considered a prophet and Elijah was one of Israel's prophets par excellence. Why in the world are they considering Jesus to be a prophet? We know from the beginning of Mark's gospel that Jesus is the Messiah, because we hear the words, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, Messiah, Son of God. Now, no other human character, though, in the whole story of Mark, up until this point in chapter 8, has had Jesus identified to them in this story as Messiah. We know it because we're spectators. We have box seats. We know what the narrator told us. So we know that Peter gets it right, that he is the Messiah. But why would all the people be identifying Jesus as a prophet? It's because between the time that we're introduced to Jesus and the time that we are on the road here to Caesarea Philippi with the disciples, we've seen Jesus do prophet-like things. He's fed people miraculously. You remember Elijah and Elisha also feeding people miraculously. He's healed people. We saw that as well with the Old Testament prophets. And he's raised a little girl from the dead. We saw that as well with Elijah. And so we've seen Jesus doing prophet-like things, as has all the people in the story. But to this point, Jesus has done nothing that people expected messiahs to do. So it's not surprising how they've identified Jesus as a prophet. But now they identify, but now Peter somehow knows to identify Jesus as the Messiah. Now Jesus, as soon as he says that, he rebukes him and he tells them not to tell anybody. He is certainly not ready to reveal that he himself understands himself that way. But the episode isn't over there. We read on. Then he began to teach them that the human one must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Now, we know that Peter just got it right. We know that he identified Jesus rightly as Messiah. But then Jesus began to tell his disciples what was going to happen to him. He began to essentially rewrite the script. And this was something that Peter had never heard of, nor had any of the other disciples. So Peter takes Jesus aside, and it's as though he says, "Hey, I just told you who you were. Why are you saying these things?" And of course, we have what's essentially like a rebuking contest going on. Peter rebukes Jesus for saying such things. This is not what messiahs are about. This is not what messiahs are to be and to do. And of course, then Jesus rebukes Peter, 3rd time in a row that word has shown up in this passage. Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It's as though Peter is stepping into the shoes of Satan as someone who is out to test Jesus's commitment to the way of being Messiah. That is what we will call the divine way of being Messiah. It certainly is an unexpected way, but it is the way of being Messiah that lies before Jesus in all the Gospels. When we approach the New Testament with the idea that somewhere in the Old Testament there was a script that was predicted for Messiah that would turn out to be exactly the shape of what Jesus said and did, the shape of his life and the shape of what happened to him. When we approach the New Testament with that idea in mind, then reading a passage like we just read is quite jarring, because it's very clear that Peter, who certainly knew his what we call Old Testament, having grown up in the synagogue all his life, clearly did not recognize the script that Jesus was laying down that would fit him in light of anything in the Old Testament. And so it makes us have to ask the question, what was Messiah in the Old Testament context? So we began by recognizing that the word Messiah is usually used when it's referring to the current king of Israel, often as the Lord's anointed one. You might remember that language when David refused to harm Saul when he had the chance. In his language, the words he used were something like, he would not touch the Lord's anointed one. That is the Lord's Messiah, the Lord's Christos, the Lord's anointed one. That language is used quite often in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, and other places. But the phrase "the Messiah," standing alone without some further identifier like the Lord's Messiah or his Messiah, the phrase "the Messiah" is not found in the Old Testament. Just go do a concordance search and you'll find that yourself. The actual word never once refers to an expected future figure in its original context. So there's no place where a prophet is predicting a future Messiah, not in the original context in which any prediction such as that would have been uttered. In a few cases, the word Messiah is in an Old Testament passage that later Jews and Christians took as referring to an expected future figure. One of those few places is Psalm 2:2, where the psalmist uses the language like, "Why do the nations rage against the Lord and his anointed one?" In its original context, it was about the current Israelite, the current king of Israel. It wasn't a prediction of a future figure, but later Jews and Christians did begin to take Psalm 2 as a prediction as the years went along. In the original Old Testament context, Messiah as a future expected, or let me say that again, as an expected future figure is not a prominent theme at all. It doesn't arise as a prominent theme until Second Temple Judaism, essentially the period that we call between the Testaments. And it comes more into focus in the first century. And so next we're going to look at Messiah in its first century context. In the first century, Jews widely believed that God would somehow bring a day or era of salvation, making all things right for Israel and for the world. And there were a plurality of figures, of expected future figures, who might play a role in it. For example, some had the idea that an ideal anointed high priest might be somehow involved in helping to bring about this era or day of salvation, based on a passage like Numbers 25:10-14, which I'll let you read in your own time. Another figure who some imagined might play a role in this day or era of salvation was a prophet like Moses, that Moses had told the Israelites about in Deuteronomy 18:15-19. There was also possibly Elijah, who was thought to have some role in bringing about this day of the Lord. And you can see how those expectations arise by reading a passage like Malachi 4:5-6. Finally, a Messiah was one of those possible expected future figures through whom God might bring this day or era of salvation to pass. But there was no particular script that all Jews agreed with on who would be involved and how. All of these figures, or a combination of them, perhaps even none of them, would be involved in this expected day that God might bring. God just might decide to do it alone. God just by himself would bring about this day of salvation. So there were a variety of views about this. The point for our purposes, though, is that a Messiah may or may not have a role in bringing this day of salvation in. I know many of you have heard people say for years that that Jews were expecting a Messiah in the first century. Well, it is true that some Jews were expecting a Messiah in the first century, but not all Jews. Not all Jews believed in a future expected messianic figure. It just depended on which of these kinds of scenarios they thought God would engage in bringing about this day or era of salvation for Israel. In the first century, numerous Jewish revolutionary groups appeared in conflict with Rome because Rome was the oppressing power that essentially occupied Israel's homeland. And a variety of groups arose in opposition to this, some of them having messianic heads. One of those groups was headed by a guy by the name of Judas, son of Ezekias, about 4 BC, somewhere about the time when Jesus would have been born. And this was not an unusual kind of occurrence to have groups in conflict with the ruling power of Rome, particularly in Galilee, where Jesus carried out most of his ministry. Another example, Simon Bar Giora was one of these groups that was the head of one of these groups who opposed Rome, particularly in the Jewish-Roman War that went from 66 to 70 when the temple was destroyed. So the point here is that Jesus was not the first or the last, for that matter, figure in first century Jewish context who was understood by some to be Messiah. The genesis for one form of messianic hope comes in the Old Testament in 2 Samuel 7, when God promises David that there will always be one of his descendants on the throne. And of course, Babylonian exile interrupted that hope, but there emerged from reflection on that passage in Second Temple Judaism the hope that there would one day be a king, an ideal Davidic king who would rule Israel and the nations. And so while there was no exact script for a Messiah in general in the first century, when that Messiah was understood in terms of the ideal Davidic king, as Jesus was portrayed as being, especially in the second half of the four Gospels, that messianic script included these king-like things: that Messiah would purify or rebuild the Jerusalem temple, that Messiah would gather, purify, and lead Jewish forces in battle to destroy those oppressing Israel, and that Messiah would rule over Israel and judge the nations. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't fit that sort of script, but at the end of the Gospels, particularly when Jesus begins to ride into Jerusalem in what we call the triumphal entry, he evokes those kinds of messianic hopes with his actions by calling for the disciples to go get a donkey on which he will ride into Jerusalem. And when he does that, he is embodying a hope that appears in Zechariah that was taken to be messianic prophecy of the time. And so by riding into Jerusalem the way he does, he evokes the response of the crowd, which includes things like them saying, "Blessed is the coming of the kingdom of our father David," or "Hosanna to the Son of David." And when Jesus dies in all four Gospels, he has the placard over his head as King of the Jews. So all four Gospels portray Jesus as the ideal Davidic king as he comes into Jerusalem at the end of their stories. Now, that script for a royal Davidic Messiah, or any other type of Messiah for that matter, did not include suffering and dying. In fact, a suffering Messiah dying on a cross at the hands of Israel's oppressors was simply unheard of before Jesus. No one ever expected such a thing. The cross was reserved in the Roman Empire for political criminals, slaves, and the lower class. While it wasn't the most painful way to die in the Roman Empire, it was the most humiliating way to die. It was a way of shaming the one who died on the cross. Now, don't get me wrong, it certainly was a painful way to die, but the shame associated with being naked, exposed on the cross, and having one's corpse naked and exposed made it the most shameful way to die in the empire. And it was indeed most often used for those who were understood to threaten Roman political order. There were thousands and thousands of young Jewish males who were crucified for doing precisely that before Jesus ever wound up on a cross at the time of his crucifixion. And there were thousands more after that the Romans would crucify. So it was not unique for there to be a young Jewish male understood to be threatening Rome's political authority to be crucified by the empire. And such a thing would immediately disqualify one from being understood as any sort of true Messiah, because for one thing, you're dead. Now, this was a scandal for early Christianity. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:23, in the middle of an argument he's making to the Corinthians, but we proclaim Messiah crucified, or Christ crucified, an utter foolishness to Greeks and a scandal to Jews. Now, why does he say that? To the Greeks, the idea that there would be a king or someone that the early Christians were already identifying with God as being divine, that there would be someone like this put on a shameful cross, was the height of foolishness. It made absolutely no sense. Now, to Jews who heard the story in the first century, it was a scandal, as Paul himself says. Remember, Paul is a Jew, and he is preaching as a Jew, and he recognizes that for Jews, Messiah crucified is a scandal. It is a scriptural scandal, for one thing. Part of that conceptuality goes back to Deuteronomy 21:23. In that passage, in its original context, it envisions someone who has been executed, and then after execution, their corpse has been hung on a tree to bring further humiliation and shame to them. And in reflecting on that particular passage and the analogy that it might have with crucifixion in the first century, the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran interpreted that passage as a reference to crucifixion. And in that passage, it says, in light of that situation of someone's corpse being hung on a tree, it says, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. In other words, cursed by God is everyone who is hung on a tree. Now, we don't have to look very far to know that early Christians had to deal with that particular issue. Those who are crucified on a cross by the Romans, are they cursed by God? Aren't they cursed by God according to Deuteronomy 21:23? Well, Paul himself has to deal with that issue. And what he does in Galatians 3:13 is quote Deuteronomy 21:23, and then he has to reinterpret it, because he understands what a scandal this is for Jewish folk when he says in that verse, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. for it is written, here's Deuteronomy 21:23, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So for Jewish folk, a Messiah, first of all, saying Christ or Messiah crucified was oxymoronic. It was like saying boiled ice. But to make matters worse, it also was a scriptural scandal, because in the first century it was a very live interpretation to understand Deuteronomy 21:23, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree, as a reference to crucifixion by the Romans, so that according to that logic, this so-called Messiah who had been hung on a Roman cross was cursed by God. This was indeed a scandal, and it was the scandal of the gospel that the early Christians had to deal with. So what was the solution to this scandal that the early church had to deal with? To put it simply, the solution was to rewrite the Messianic script. All four gospel accounts have Jesus dying with the placard above his head that reads, King of the Jews, which of course is how a Roman authority would have described what Jesus was being crucified for, if in fact he was being hailed as Messiah by Jewish people. The Roman authority would have known that Jesus was being proclaimed as King of the Jews. And so all four Gospels have Jesus dying with that placard above his head. And all four Gospels also have God vindicating him as precisely that, as King of the Jews, true King of the Jews, by raising him from the grave. And so while death disqualifies any first century figure from being understood as true Messiah by anyone in the first century, when God raises him from the dead, this changes things. In fact, resurrection causes the Messianic script to have to be now rewritten so that that script matches Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. That script is rewritten so that now various Old Testament passages are reinterpreted in light of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, and then Jesus's life, death, and resurrection are interpreted in light of various Old Testament passages. As one example of that, and it's one that you probably already had questions about to this point in the lecture, but one example of that is the way that early Christians now returned to read passages like Isaiah 52 and 53 about Isaiah's suffering servant. You see, now Isaiah's suffering servant passages begin to be used to understand what God was doing in Jesus, and that suffering servant figure is now understood in light of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as having to do with Jesus himself. Now, the word Messiah never appears anywhere in that passage. In fact, the only place that Messiah ever appears in the entire book of Isaiah is in Isaiah 45, when God calls Cyrus the Persian my Messiah, my anointed one, because he's actually going to deliver Israel from Babylonian control. But the word Messiah never appears in this passage, where this servant of God somehow suffers on behalf of others and is vindicated by God. And it was prior to the time of Jesus, that passage was never understood as being associated with Messiah. It was only after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that the early Christians, perhaps under Jesus' own tutelage, returned to reread those passages in light of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and then begin to see how God was somehow at work and what God was doing in this one who was crucified as Messiah. Now, we're going to reread or reinterpret a psalm text in another lecture. In fact, Psalm 146, 5-10, that speaks about God's ruling and God's reigning, what it looks like when God reigns, to see how that passage can be understood in light of what Jesus actually does in the Gospels. It's not that that passage predicts anything. It's not predicting that someone's going to come and rule like this. It's just a pattern. It shows us a pattern of what it looks like when God rules. And then in light of what we see in Jesus, we can reread that text and say, Jesus fulfills, that is, he fills with significance this psalm text. We'll see that in another lecture. It's now time to draw some of this to a close. So, the upshot of this lecture is that no one could have predicted a figure like Jesus to be the royal Davidic Messiah simply by reading the Old Testament. In other words, they couldn't find a pre-made script for a royal Davidic Messiah who would look like Jesus. That was just simply already there, and all you had to do was go and just read the Old Testament, and you could predict that this kind of thing would happen. Now, we've already seen evidence for that in the way that Jesus has this encounter with Peter, when Peter gets it right, but he couldn't recognize anything about the script that Jesus was writing for himself. But we don't have to look far for further evidence of this. All we have to do is go to Paul's experience in Acts. Now, both Paul and Peter are Jews raised in synagogue, and especially Paul has been trained at the feet of one of the best, one of the most famous rabbinic teachers of his day, Gamaliel. And even he, when he hears the story about a crucified Messiah that people were saying had been raised, he certainly doesn't associate that with any Messianic script that one could find in the Old Testament. In Acts, in fact, he has to be encountered by the risen Lord and then knocked on the ground, not off a horse, there's no horse there, but he has to be knocked on the ground, and it has to essentially be revealed to him that this one that he is speaking with is the crucified and risen Lord. And his own language in Galatians 1:15-16 shows us that it requires a revelation from God to reread Scripture, to see how it somehow witnesses to a crucified and raised Jesus. Galatians 1:15-16, Paul says something like, when it pleased God to reveal his Son in or by means of me. He uses the very language of revelation. In fact, in the parallel passage in Matthew where Peter and Jesus had the encounter on the road to Caesarea Philippi, when Peter claims that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus' response to him there, slightly different from Mark, is to say, blessed are you, Simon, son of John, because what? Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. In other words, for Peter to even be able to have confessed that about Jesus based on the way that Jesus' life has looked to that particular point in time took a revelation from God. It's just not naturally there. Jesus hasn't fit any pre-existing Messianic script. And we also ought to note the disciples' confusion and lack of expectation of anything after Jesus' death. One place we can see that is when the four in Jesus' inner circle, Peter, James, Andrew, and John come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus tells them not to say anything about what they've seen until after he's been raised from the dead. And they come down, and Mark tells us as they're coming down in Mark 9, they're all coming down wondering what this rising from the dead thing means that he's referring to. Now, again, quite clearly, for them to be all Jews, raised in synagogue, and not having any idea what this man, who Peter has just claimed to be Messiah, means by rising from the dead, that ought to tell us that there just wasn't this pre-existing script of someone who would be a Messiah, who would die and then be raised by God. And of course, in all four Gospels, after the resurrection, in their resurrection accounts at the end, none of the disciples go to the tomb expecting anything other than just finding a dead body there. So Peter does get it right, but even he can't make sense of a script like this until after the resurrection. And the Christian claim is not that the Old Testament is some magic book that somehow predicts that there will be a figure exactly like Jesus, and it's right there on the pages of the Old Testament for anyone to read. And if we'll just follow that script, we'll see exactly how it all worked out. The Christian claim is not that, but more that Jesus fulfills or fills many Old Testament passages with marvelous significance that we couldn't have seen prior to his life, death, and resurrection, but that God, in his grace and mercy, has now revealed to us as we reread the Old Testament in light of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Until we understand that, we will not understand why the gospel of a crucified Messiah was such a scandal in the first century, and maybe even our own.